In 2017, the movement for Black Lives, by 2017, the movement for Black Lives has succeeded in highlighting deep racial disparities in our nation's criminal justice system. Disparities that do continue to this day, as our speakers have emphasized. Those racial disparities are not limited to criminal justice. They extend to our immigration and deportation systems, and they do so in a profound way. The Black Alliance for Just Immigration is mobilizing to call attention to and correct those disparities, and more generally to spread the word that immigrant rights are emphatically a racial justice issue. Please welcome, ladies and gentlemen, Carl Lipscombe. Hey.
On the screen isn't me. He's David Felix, and he's not as recognizable as Philando Castile or Mike Brown or Trayvon Martin, but he too was killed by the police back in 2015. To his family and friends, he was a 24-year-old aspiring fashion student and proud undocumented Haitian immigrant with a love for history. According to his friends, he had a zest for life. He could dance salsa and merengue and eagerly offered unsolicited fashion makeovers. Since his arrival in New York City in 2007, when he was 16, he'd forged a family in the runaway and homeless youth community. When his own younger brothers arrived in the U.S. from Haiti, he cared for them in their own words, just like a father. Now, as a black immigrant in this country, David suffered the consequences of both anti-black racism and unjust immigration laws. He'd previously been arrested for a few minor drug charges. Most people don't realize that one can get deported for minor offenses like marijuana possession. He was turned over to ICE and placed in deportation proceedings. He spent 2 years in immigration detention. When he was finally released, his record and incarceration limited his opportunities for employment and supportive housing, so he struggled through the shelter system and to access social services from multiple youth programs. In the fall of 2014, a few months before he was killed, he was granted housing at a shelter for those with mental illnesses. On the day that David was killed, he was under surveillance by a local precinct because, according to them, he was quote-unquote trouble. And he was also a suspect after a string of alleged purse snatchings. So they showed up at his shelter, buzzed the front office, which due to the time of day only had one staff person on duty. And the woman that answered told them that the building houses people with mental health issues and that David had been diagnosed with schizophrenia. According to the detectives, when they entered his unit, he tried to run down a fire escape, and he was aggressive. And so they shot him. David's death at the hands of those officers will be his last incident in a long history of being criminalized simply for being who he was, for living his day-to-day life, for being with his friends on the street, and for trying to pursue what little left of the American dream that we still have. Our model of criminalization has expanded to such an extent in this country that it touched every single aspect of David's life. And as a black immigrant that also suffered from homelessness and mental health issues, he experienced constant violence in the form of poverty, xenophobia, criminalization of homelessness and mental health issues, as well as systemic anti-black racism. So I share David's story because it speaks to the unique social challenges faced by black immigrants, criminalization, economic inequality, and of course the impact of harsh immigration policies, but also the challenges faced by our community that are perpetuated by well-meaning advocates like many of us in this room. One of the reasons that the work of my organization, the Black Alliance for Just Immigration, is important is because black immigrants from Africa, the Caribbean, and across the diaspora are invisible. What I mean by this is that when black immigrants are portrayed, when immigrants are portrayed on television, it's rarely a black face that we see. When policymakers, elected officials, and advocates discuss immigration, they don't discuss it in the context of race. And even within the broader discourse, if one just closes their eyes and imagine an immigrant, I place a bet that the person that comes to mind is rarely black. And as a result, oftentimes black immigrants are left out of the immigration debate, and black immigrant communities are under-resourced and misunderstood. To address this, we must start to recognize that immigration is a black issue, and anti-blackness and racial justice are immigration issues. Oh, sorry. So we as black people have struggled throughout our history to live, thrive, and fully participate in this society. And the same holds true for black immigrants. Like African Americans, black immigrants face unique challenges that create barriers when it comes to employment, education, and criminalization. But we also face an additional threat of detention and deportation, which is a life sentence because we're immigrants. In fact, black immigrants make up just 5% of the US immigration population, but almost 25% of those in immigration detention as a result of criminal contact. 1 out of 5 immigrants deported because of contact with the criminal law system is black. Nearly a quarter of black immigrants in the country live below the federal poverty line. And despite having amongst the highest education attainment rates of all immigrant groups, 30% of black immigrants have a college degree, black immigrants have the highest unemployment rates of all immigrants. Now, unfortunately, for the last 20 years, the immigration movement and immigration advocates, overall, and in our immigration discussion, has been almost solely in the context of Latinx immigration, specifically white Latino immigration focused. And I use the male context of this because it's white, to go further, it's white male Latino. Whenever there's discussion about turning out voters, they're really talking about Latino voters, and most advocacy efforts target Latino immigrants. The second thing is that advocates have focused primarily on uplifting the economic contributions of immigrants to the U.S., which, as previous speakers mentioned, perpetuates a good versus bad immigrant frame, which is indeed grounded in white supremacy and anti-blackness. And I really believe this narrative has gotten us in the losing position that we're in today. Fortunately, many immigration advocates are starting to come around, but if we're truly going to uplift immigration as a racial justice issue, we have to do a few things. First, we have to recognize that immigration and criminalization are two sides of the same coin. Our immigration system is modeled off of our criminal justice system. The surveillance tools, the militarization tools used by local law enforcement are also used by ICE. So we, as immigration advocates, criminal justice advocates, those that work to combat surveillance, need to work in tandem on our overlapping causes. Second, we have to stop relying on the same old stories to tell our case. And this might be a little provocative, but we have to stop talking about immigrant workers and immigrant business owners and the valedictorian and the dreamer, because these talking points are dog whistles against black people who are stereotyped as lazy and uneducated and felons, quite frankly. Third, we have to stop talking about assimilation and integration as the primary goal of our movement, because again, this message reeks of anti-blackness. When we hear discussion of integration and assimilation, they're not talking about assimilating into Black America. They're trying to avoid the experience of black people. I know this myself. When I was growing up, my family's Trinidadian, I was taught not to associate with African Americans, and I imagine that many of you share this experience. And that's really how deep anti-black racism is ingrained in our society, that my family that's black also held these stereotypes, but that doesn't make it okay. And we have to recognize that citizenship is not a magic bullet that will resolve all of the challenges facing immigrants. I cringe every time I'm in spaces and people are talking about organizing for a path to citizenship. It's a very important protection against deportation, at least for now, because this administration is trying to change that. But any African American will tell you that they gained citizenship almost 150 years ago, and they've been fighting ever since, from Reconstruction to Jim Crow to Selma to the new Jim Crow and back. Now, I recognize that this is an academic conference, and I didn't spend too much time discussing our research on black immigrants, and we have it. You can visit our website, thestateofblackimmigrants.com, and we have an entire report on black immigrants in the U.S. But I did this because, we have the solutions. We've heard speakers, countless speakers today, lay out dozens of solutions, and we already know them. We know where to find them. We can research them. But I think it's important that we uplift this bigger picture, and that's that we need to create a movement that's transformative, that recognizes racial inequities, and that's committed to protecting the civil and human rights of all immigrants, black people, Muslims, trans and queer communities, women, and all victims of oppression in the U.S. Thank you.
So we're running a little short on time, but we do have time for at least one question for Carl. Let me make sure there's no one else who hasn't asked a question just yet. Please, go ahead.
Hello. Hello. Yeah, my question is, I understand why assimilation is bad. Why integration?
I think that the context in which it's spoken of, integration, it's important that immigrants and all communities are able to fully participate in our society. I think when integration is discussed, it's often discussed as this sort of, immigrants are in the U.S. to contribute economically and to start businesses and to get an education. And it's really, and my organization works with African American and Black immigrant communities, and when we talk about this, it's a dog whistle. It's rarely discussed as we're going to integrate into Black America, into the experience of African Americans. And many Black people take the assimilation and integration frame as a slap in the face and saying that, the immigrants' rights movement is going to succeed where the civil rights movement didn't. Where the civil rights movement didn't succeed in, gaining educational equity and strong voter rights and combating policing, the immigrants' rights movement is going to, enable immigrants to integrate into society, and everything's going to be perfect.
Thank you so much.
No problem.
Appreciate it.